Hey there, I'm Stalnaker with Hub Culture here in Davos, and we're at our first event streaming live on Facebook. So for our viewers who will be coming in and catching this even later over the next few days digitally, welcome to the digital side of Davos. Hub Culture is celebrating its 12th year here in Davos, and for me personally, 14 years. So it's amazing to see the evolution and the change in the city related to the World Economic Forum, which is this year celebrating its 50th anniversary. The Davos Manifesto is the key message coming out of the forum this year, and it's a look not only at the past 50 years, but the creation and ideation for the future society, the next 50 years. And our version of that is looking at co-creating the future society. That's the theme of the Hub Culture Pavilion this year here in Davos. So we're about to kick off with our first conversation. It's a 3-hour discussion, participatory discussion, on what we call the 1.5 degree imperative. Now this is a collaboration that came out of COP25 in the hub in Madrid, where we worked with Nexus and Nexus Global to think about the climate initiative generally and what we can all be doing towards the climate initiative. And in a conversation with the elders, there was a discussion about this idea of the 1.5 degree imperative. And what that means is that the target for agreed sort of allowable climate change is 1.5 degrees. And if we see a temperature rise sustained above that level, we're going to actually see some very drastic and potentially like upward curve consequences that could be essentially not very good. And you could even say very bad, depending on how high we go. So this is a conversation to talk about why the 1.5 degree imperative is important, and more importantly, to ideate how we can get to that goal. Because the reality is that right now we're not on track for that goal. If we don't do anything, which is pretty much what's happening now, especially when you look at governmental and intergovernmental relations, we're actually on track for potentially 3 degrees or even higher. And 3 degrees or even higher is something we honestly don't even want to think about, because when you start to get to that level, you're looking at like massive disruptive changes, migrations for millions and millions of people, cities that we know and love being slightly underwater, things like that. But in between that, is say from 3 degrees down to 1.5, are still potentially catastrophic consequences. For instance, here in Switzerland, if we hit 2 degrees, all the glaciers in Switzerland will be gone. That means that water supply from the Alps to most of Europe will be severely threatened. At 1.5 degrees, water loss and glacier loss in the Himalayas means that both India and China will be under extreme water stress. It also means that the oceans rise just enough to essentially flood the Mekong with salt, which means that the most productive, fertile food production area of Asia would essentially be ruined due to salt water. So that's just at 1.5 degrees. So ideally, we'd figure out technologically how to go under 1.5 degrees in terms of climate and carbon mitigation. And the leaders that we have here joining us today for this conversation are the people who are focused on trying to do that. Now, joining me first for this Facebook Live is my good friend and ally, William McDonough. The building that we're in is called the Ice House, and it was created by William 5 years ago under request and plea from us at Hub Culture for more space. And when I said to Bill, we need more space, he said, let's think beyond space and think about how use and reuse of materials can actually create a better world. And the Ice House is the testament to that. So joining us is Bill. Thank you. Let's have a seat. And for everybody who's here, thanks for joining us. Thank you, Bill. Can you tell us a little bit about your vision for how material use and reuse can help us avoid going above 1.5 degrees at large? Like, what needs to happen on the circular economy for us to hit this target?
I think there are many vectors involved in putting this in that context. The idea that buildings have the ability to be storage of carbon, for example, for future use means we design for end of use instead of designing for end of life. For example, when you hear someone say, I'm designing for end of life, I get nervous because it's a human projection often on an inanimate object. So these things aren't alive. But this building is designed to be used over and over again, and its parts can be utilized in different ways. And finally, at the end of their use period as structural struts, that's aluminum, and so on. So this is the 5th year here. It's been elsewhere. So the idea that things can be used and reused is going to be important. And that means we're designing in between the ephemeral and the eternal coherently. So things that are ephemeral are things like cherry blossoms or this building. This building is here for 1 week. Can you imagine that? This goes up in a day and a half. It'll come down when you've all finished with it. It'll be put in a 20-foot container, off to its next use. So this is actually like a cherry blossom. It's here today, gone tomorrow. And that's ephemera. But it's feeding a system that is utile. The cherry blossom feeds the soil. This building can feed the future industry. So that, I think, idea is really important. Since the building sector is about 40% of the energy use, obviously buildings matter in energy consumption, but the idea of the materials as banks and even as carbon banks, I think is an important idea. And then also, how do we go about thinking about energy and materials at the same time? And carbon actually has this dual nature. It's both an energy source and a material. So one of the things I'm most focused on right now is a new language of carbon. And we publish that in Nature as carbon is not the enemy. Because I'm very concerned, especially in the climate discussions, when we say carbon is the enemy or I'm trying to be carbon negative. I think it's confusing to children. One of the things, I think a problem we have with sustainability as a movement is that the word itself is a bit odd. Because if I asked you what's your relationship to your spouse, and you said sustainable, I'd say, I'm sorry, that doesn't really sound that exciting. And then, but on the other hand, we see people saying, or hear people saying, I'm going to be carbon negative, and that's positive. And that, again, is confusing to children, because it's a double negative, trying to be a positive. And so that reminds me of people saying, I'm going to be less bad, when they mean to say, I'm going to be good. Problem is, they're being less bad. So you're by definition being bad, just less so. So, again, not that exciting. So how do we be more good? Is really the question. So on climate, we can get to that, but buildings have a big role in this, and so do cities and things. So we're working on the design of molecules all the way up to countries and regions through buildings with this philosophy. And this little pavilion is a little testimony to the fact that it is possible.
And Bill, how do you talked about the ephemeral and the eternal, and then we're somewhere in between those two things right now. How do you see the design philosophy of circular economy being applied towards a solution that can actually help us to get to the targets that we need to get to? Because unfortunately right now we're on track for failure, so we have to course correct. How do we course correct?
I think we need a new design. That's really what it comes down to. Design is intention being manifested. And so we need a new intention and a new design. And the fundamental issue around atmospheric transformations has to do with carbon emissions. And so if we have a hydrocarbon-powered world, we're begging the question and the problem. And so I think there's two things there. One is to look at what we are going to do with hydrocarbons, practically. And so that's, this next year I'll be dedicating a lot of the work to that. And it's that, again, this idea of we can make durable objects with carbon and they can last generations, like plastics. See, plastics are not the enemy either. It's us. It's how we use them, just like how we use carbon. So that's a durable carbon. So we have to stop fugitive carbon, either in atmospheric gases or as durables in the ocean. So a coherent system. But when you look at the renewables and they're coming on board, it looked like for a moment there, about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, that we might find that renewables could start to play a bigger role than they do now, but on a trajectory of a hockey stick. And that is still in play, it's just not fast enough. So even with what's coming on board in renewables, we still see the hydrocarbon demand
Still
skyrocketing, literally, right? And so we need to really grapple with this thing. And so I think we're going to be surprised that once you open the door to that idea, and we start to see renewables come down, we're seeing in the Middle East right now below 1 cent a kilowatt hour, which is pretty astonishing, that we can start to move to hydrogen because we can use renewable energy to make hydrogen, and then start working with that instead of just burning carbons and so on. So we're going to have to take all the tricks we can find, get them to work. But the game is really serious, and it does involve new technology at scale. So I think that's really the key to this. And the other element at the same time is see carbon as an asset that can be thought of as a material instead of as a fuel. So that over the next 20, 30 years,